That didn't. Okay. We are live.
All right. Welcome to Medieval Times. Let's ask God's blessing on our time together. Thank you, Father, for the truth that you have given to us. And even during the Middle Ages, we see over and over again the truth getting out from time to time, although there were great efforts to suppress it. We thank you that it's so available for us today. And even as we were just talking about the necessity of plays in the Middle Ages to communicate truth, and how we all have multiple Bibles that we can read, and so many other sources as well. We thank you for the great blessing of that, and we know that with that comes responsibility. So Lord, help us to use what we have available to us for the benefit of those around us, and for the proclaiming of the gospel, the advancement of your kingdom. And may what we do tonight be a small part of that. In Jesus' name, amen. We are going to go back in time a little bit to something we've covered before. I'm just going to go over it briefly, just to give us kind of a sliding into where I want us to go next. And so in your notes, it says a European empire. Since the time of the Tower of Babel, men have dreamed of a universal empire that will unite all the peoples of the earth under one government. And we saw Alexander the Great attempting that. The Roman Empire. Well, that became part of what's going on in Europe in the 10th century with the founding of what's called the Holy Roman Empire. That begins by looking at the founding of the German kingdom. You may remember this map, or it may look familiar to you. Hopefully it does. Because we've looked at what happened to the empire of Charles the Great, called Charlemagne. Upon his death, it was divided into three kingdoms for his three sons. And you know that from them on, the descendants of Charles were weak and unable, especially in the East Franklin area, ruled by the kingdom of Louis, as there were inroads being made by the Magyars from that direction. The Magyars were savage horsemen who were terrorizing southeastern Europe. And as they came in, and the vacuum of leadership that occurred throughout Europe then were filled by local tribal leaders called dukes, who were ruling like kings over territories called duchies. They eventually elected one of their own to lead them against the Magyars, the Saxon Duke Henry the Fowler, whom we've looked at earlier. Henry the Fowler, you can see the dates there of when he reigned. And is considered the founder of the medieval German state. He had many fortifications, cavalry to try to go against the Magyars, and eventually routed them in 933. The son of Henry was Otto the First, often called Otto the Great. This son of Henry desired to claim authority over the rest of the land, using the bishops that he had appointed to supply the vassalage necessary to bring the other duchies under his control. In other words, remember that we talked before about how bishops were not only had ecclesiastical office, but also owned land. And so that made them vassals in that feudal system underneath the king. And because he appointed bishops, therefore, the vassalage was to him, and he used that to gain authority. And he was also able to defeat the Magyars and push them to settle in the lower Danube valley, where they became known as Hungarians. Otto the First was invited to Italy to solve Pope John XII's problems, which mostly were the Lombards who were surrounding him, and to bring peace and solidification to the papacy. And when doing so, he became the practical ruler of Italy. In 962, Otto came to Rome to be crowned as emperor by Pope John. Remember, this was a time of such low morality in the church that the papacy was called the pornocracy. Remember that? The conquests and coronation of Otto revived the memory of the Carolingian and Roman empires. Because of its alliance with the Roman Church and its symbolic association with the Empire of Ancient Rome, the German Empire became known as the Holy Roman Empire. And as I have mentioned to you before, I think it was Voltaire pointed out that it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. Next, we come to the conflict within the empire. Again, this is review. For several generations, German rulers began to pay more attention to Italy than to Germany. And so because their focus was on Italy, the nobles of Germany began to acquire more and more power in the vacuum left by the absence of their king or emperor. And as we indicated before, conflict arose over the appointment of church officials by the emperors, even to the extent that popes themselves sometimes were chosen by the emperor. As the Cluniac reforms spread throughout the Roman Church, the popes began to challenge the emperor's authority, especially in the matter of lay investiture, of appointing bishops, of a layperson appointing bishops, and so on. And this came to a head, you remember, with the conflict between Pope Gregory VII, who formerly was known as Hildebrand, who wielded much power over a number of popes, appointing several popes before he himself took the job. Conflict between he and Emperor Henry IV. Initially successful at the Alpine settlement of Canossa, remember where Henry stood outside in the snow in his bare feet for several days in response to being excommunicated by Pope Gregory VII, and also an interdict being placed upon Germany. And the Pope eventually forgave him. But then later on, Henry turned around and invaded Italy, and the Pope Gregory VII ended up fleeing into exile in response to the invasion by Henry IV. This domination of the papacy by German rulers did not endure, however, as eventually we come to popes such as Innocent III, who were able to interfere in the political affairs of the empire and weaken the emperor's authority. The third and perhaps most damaging conflict within the empire was the one between the German nobles and the Holy Roman Empire. Oops, I'm not there yet. For almost a century, while emperors had been preoccupied with Italian affairs, the German nobles had enjoyed great independence. The situation began to change, however, when a new royal line, the Salian house, succeeded the Saxon kings. The Saxon kings, including Henry IV, were unsuccessful in their attempts to establish a strong, centralized monarchy that would weaken the power of the great nobles. After the death of Henry's son, who had died without an heir, civil war broke out among the rival noble families who competed for the crown. The civil wars further weakened the German monarchy and led to the development of feudalism throughout the empire. The large duchies in Italy and Germany broke up into many small states. Powerful nobles became feudal lords, forcing lesser nobles to become their vassals. During this period, several of the strongest nobles firmly established the practice of electing the German monarch. The power of the nobles was supreme in the land. And what we find it in both Italy and Germany, they are the last of the countries of Europe to be formed. Up until right before World War I, there still was not a Germany and not an Italy per se. It was broken up into smaller states. And it was Kaiser Wilhelm of Prussia who unites Germany, which then leads them into World War I. Next, we come to the empire under the Hohenstaufens. I don't speak German, so I hope I'm saying that correctly. Brian, do you have any input on that? In 1152, the German princes hoped to bring an end to the Civil War by choosing a king, a member of the Hohenstaufen family, who was Frederick. Frederick I then, who was also called Barbarossa because he had a red beard. And he sought to restore the glory and stability of what he termed the Holy Empire. Like previous German kings, Frederick meddled in Italian affairs. His expeditions brought strong papal opposition. Although most of Frederick's advances into Italy ended in failure, he was successful in forming a marriage alliance between his son and the heiress of the Kingdom of Sicily. So if you'll look on the map here. Whoops. What is that? What is it? Here's Sicily down here. Here's the boot of Italy, and there's Sicily. Oftentimes, throughout much of history, independent kingdom, oftentimes ruled by many different groups of people, empires that came through there over the years. So here's the ruler of Germany, having his son marry into this kingdom of Sicily. The most notable Hohenstaufen ruler was Frederick II, the grandson of Frederick I. Frederick is heir not only to the German throne, but also to the throne of Sicily. That's why it was important to see that connection. So he's ruling over both those areas. The latter kingdom, Sicily, was established by the Normans in the 11th century and included all of southern Italy. So you can see by the color of the map here that Sicily not only is a kingdom here, but it has established control over that part of Italy. Now, it was established by Normans. Normans are from up in this area. Frederick II grew up in Sicily because he's the son of his father was the son that married the princess in Sicily. And there because of the location, he became acquainted with Greek and Arab cultures. Later, his court would become a leading center of culture. One of the most learned men of his day, he also distinguished himself as a patron of artists and scholars. Can you tell that from the picture, the painting of Frederick II? What do you see that indicates that he is a man of culture? Yeah. So there's, this is here because he's also a man of war. He's a king. He's got the crown. That's a German symbol there on his crown, but holding the harp indicates that he is a man of culture. And as a boy, Frederick II not only was raised in Sicily with all of the culture that was available, but he was also the ward of Pope Innocent III, the most powerful man in Europe. Innocent recognized the threat of having Hohenstaufen's possessions encircling the Papal States, because here's Frederick II is in control of this and this. So you can see the Papal States are surrounded. And Innocent III was concerned about that. Therefore, he secured the German throne for Frederick in return for his promise to give up the throne of Sicily. So he said, look, I'm powerful enough, I can make sure you get the throne of Germany, but you got to promise me to give up Sicily. So I'm not totally surrounded. Shortly after Innocent's death, however, Frederick broke his promise. He devoted almost all his attention to Sicily and Italy, leaving the feudal princes of Germany relatively free from imperial interference. So once again, a Germanic king is paying more attention to Italy. I'm not sure what the draw is. Nicer weather, better food. They all seem to be interested in Italy. Frederick expanded his Italian holdings and might have united all of Italy under his control had it not been for the resistance of the papacy. The death of Frederick II, or you wanted to show you a picture of Innocent III there. The death of Frederick II in 1250 marked the decline of the Holy Roman Empire. German kings continued to call themselves Holy Roman Emperors, but their contact with Italy became minimal. The attempts of the German emperors to unite Germany and Italy ended in failure. Their lack of success marked the beginning of a long period of disunity for the two countries. And as I said before, it's not until the late 19th century, early 20th century that Italy and Germany became unified national states. All right, a lot of that was review of things that we have talked about before, leading us up into this time period of the late 1100s, 1200s. Although now we're going to go to England and go back even further and try to get a running start on what's happening in England. So we're going to see here the rise of feudal monarchies in different nations, starting with England. And first of all, we're going to look at Alfred the Great. As I have listened and read different things about Alfred the Great over the years, I find that there are some historians who question his existence, and I'm not sure why, because there seems to be a lot of evidence for his existence. I think there are some historians who gain fame by questioning things or something. I don't know, but it seems to me that we know a lot about Alfred the Great and his time period. One thing I will point out to you at the very outset, I have a particular interest in Alfred the Great because he is an ancestor of my wife. So she, claims to have some royalty, that if everybody in England who is royal dies, she might have a shot at the throne. The background is this. Soon after the Roman soldiers left England in the early 5th century, Germanic tribes from Northern Europe, known as the Angles and the Saxons, invaded Britain. You can see on the map the movement of the Angles in yellow arrows and the Saxons in red. And then we have people called the Jutes who moved into the area of southern England and part of Wales. The Angles and the Saxons established their own independent kingdoms and transformed Roman Britain into Angle land or England. During the 9th century, the Danes, which were Scandinavian Vikings, began to raid the land with little resistance until King Alfred the Great came on the scene. The ruler of the Saxon kingdom of Wessex, you can see there in southwestern England, Alfred defeated the Danes, pushing them back into northeastern England. There's a closer look at Wessex, and Northumbria would be the northeastern area. So the Anglo-Saxons took control of most of Britain, but they never conquered Scotland, Wales, I lost my, oh, there it is, and an area called Cornwall. They divided the country into kingdoms, each with its own royal family. The stronger kingdoms often took control of the weaker kingdoms. By around AD 600, the 5 main Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were somewhat familiar names to us if you know anything about England: Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, Kent, and Anglia. Okay, the rise and rule of Alfred. The rise. First of all, Alfred was the youngest son of Ethelwulf, King of Wessex, whose parents desired him to enter the service of the church. He had been taken on 2 pilgrimages to Rome as a boy. The death of his father and 2 elder brothers led the Witan, which was the local group of nobles, to elect him as king. You know, many times in history, there have been occasions where the oldest son who was to become king dies, and a younger son who is not prepared becomes king. And this was one of those occasions. As far as rule goes, in the area of government, he strengthened the Anglo-Saxon practice of local government, dividing his realm into many local districts called shires. If you know Tolkien at all, you know about shires. That's an English thing. It's like a county, and it's governed by officials called shire reeves, or we call them sheriff. That's where we get that word. In the military, he accomplished 3 things for his kingdom that later helped strengthen all of England. First of all, he established a military class that could be called on at any time to protect the kingdom. So not exactly a professional army, but close to that. Next, he built fortifications along the coast. Soldiers in these fortifications watched for Viking raiders. And then thirdly, he developed the English Navy with which to attack the Vikings at sea. This earned him the title founder of the English Navy. So Alfred the Great, a number of things he did militarily to strengthen England. In the area of learning, he also had a great influence. Alfred brought about a religious and intellectual revival. He built churches, founded schools, and invited foreign scholars to his court. Sons of noblemen and freemen could be educated through the schools built throughout the kingdom, developing something unique, a literate lay community. Next, scholars began to translate important literary works into the common language of the people. Alfred himself translated many Christian works into the common language, and also had parts of the New Testament translated. Many have called him the father of the English prose. I thought I had seen somewhere that a translation that he did of maybe some of the Psalms as well. And of course, this would have been from Latin, but into the Saxon language. Wouldn't be like modern English. And thirdly, monks began to compile the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which traces the history of England from Roman times to Alfred's day. A lot of interesting things in that chronicle. I've not read the chronicle, but I've read some things from it. And if I remember correctly, there are some things that are in that chronicle that are quoted by Bill Cooper in his book. I'm not quite grasping the book. It has to do with after the flood. That's what it's called, After the Flood. And I highly recommend that. If you want to borrow, I think I still have a copy or two. But he details a lot of things that happened after the flood. Basically, how people scattered, and how the royal lines of Europe, when they trace their lineage, they go all the way back. They trace it back to Japheth. written down that they go back to Japheth. And so they believed that they were descendants of Japheth, certainly, and in Noah and the flood. And he also talks about some of the things, I think, in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, as well as some other sources that detail some very interesting things from a biblical perspective. One of the things that he details in there, too, are the number of times in which dinosaurs are talked about as appearing, or pterodactyls, or flying reptiles, things like that are indicated in these historical records. So very interesting book. Now, in the area of ministry, the process by which the Norse kingdoms all came to embrace Christianity began when the Danish Norsemen submitted to Christian baptism as part of a peace treaty with Alfred the Great. I don't have that on a slide. So, as a part of a peace treaty, the Danes submitted to Christian baptism. Now, he's called the Great, and I think if you look at the different things that we've talked about that he accomplished, you can see that he truly did earn that. He earned it not just because of the things he did, but because of the strength of his character. He won the love and respect of his people. His life demonstrated that the true greatness lies not in wealth or worldly fame, but in a man's character. Not necessarily what a man does, but in what he is. That was how he earned the name the Great. Any questions about Alfred the Great? Truly one of the great men of history. All right, afterward, as things go, less than a century after Alfred's death, the Danes renewed their attacks, defeating the English and making England part of the Danish Empire under Canute. I think we've mentioned him before as well. And you can see that the Danish territory is this area. Although Canute ruled England well, his successors were weak, and the Anglo-Saxons eventually drove them out, placing Edward the Confessor, a descendant of Alfred, on the throne. King Edward the Confessor was the son of Ethelred the Unready. I don't know if you remember talking about him before. Ethelred means well advised. Unready doesn't necessarily mean unprepared, it means poor advice. So he was the well advised who got poor advice. His name was a bit of a pun. Well, good old Ethelred the Unready died in 1016, and later his son Edward the Confessor was king in 1042. That very same year, he started on what would become Westminster Abbey. It was St. Peter's Abbey at that time, but he changed it around and began building it and began adding to it. There's a picture of Westminster Abbey today. I'm not sure what it looked like at his time. It was consecrated in 1065, just in time for King Edward the Confessor's death. He died in January of 1066, and he was the first king to be buried in Westminster Abbey. Later that year, something else important happened, 1066. Anybody remember? I mean, does that date ring a bell? 1066. No, that's later. That's 1215. 1066. What?
Christmas Day of 1066.
What about Christmas Day of 1060? Is that?
The conqueror was crowned.
Yeah. Okay. What happened before he was crowned? What's his name imply? Not imply. What's his name say about him? He's a conqueror. Yeah. In 1066, William the Conqueror conquered England, and then later that year was crowned in Westminster Abbey. But so we'll come to that next. William of Normandy conquers England. Before we do that, here's just a kind of back up and look at how the map of Europe looked 1050 to 1275, the time period we're looking at here. This doesn't show all the divisions in England, but here's the Holy Roman Empire down into Italy, and here's the Kingdom of Sicily. Here's France over here. I see Strasbourg, which is today in France, was in what might be called Germany, then the Holy Roman Empire at least. And that's true of a number of places. When we went into northern Italy, it was very Germanic, except for the language being spoken. And the same thing of Strasbourg was very, the street signs and everything were Germanic, even though it's in France today. Worms is not very far away. I thought Worms was further north. Oh no, it's Wittenberg that's up in this area. Worms is nearby. Heidelberg. These are places we'll come to later when we get to the Reformation. All right, Edward the Confessor. By the way, I should have mentioned, why was he called the Confessor? He was called that because he was a very religious guy. And when he died, he left no successor. In April of 1066, Halley's Comet appeared in the European sky, signifying to the superstitious medieval men all kinds of disasters. When a comet appeared, they assumed that something bad was going to happen. And some predicted that a kingdom would see changes. Edward left no successor, and so his cousin William, the French Duke of Normandy, claimed the throne, asserting that Edward had promised it to him. No one else heard this promise. No, really, he whispered it to me last time I saw him. He said I was supposed to be his successor. Honest. Well, the English nobles didn't agree. They didn't want this guy living over in what we call France today to be ruling over them. They refused. Instead, they elected a guy named Harold. Note the spelling because there may be some confusion later. He was the powerful Earl of Wessex and Edward's brother-in-law. They said, this will keep it in the family and in, more importantly, geographical area. William refused to be deprived, and having obtained the blessing of the Pope, he raised a large army to invade England. Now, in order to take the English throne from Harold, William had to transport his army across the English Channel. By August, William's men had built about 1,000 ships, similar to the Viking longboats. And William gathered his forces for the crossing. So, okay, August, he's ready to go. He's going to invade England. However, strong northerly winds detained him. And so he has to wait and wait because the wind's blowing the wrong way. He can't invade until the wind shifts. Meanwhile, another guy by the name of Harold also, his name is spelled Harald, and this is Harold of Norway, decided to invade England. You know, this transition, it's a good time to invade. He based his claim to be king on his relationship to Canute. Remember Canute, who had been there before? And so he was aided by these northerly winds. That helped him to come down to England. And his forces landed in the north of England in September. Harold, Old, of Wessex, gathered a large force and hurried northward to counter the Norwegian threat. On September 25th at Stamford Bridge, just east of York, the two forces met, ending with the defeat of the Norsemen and the death of Harold of Norway. But while the English were celebrating their victory, the winds shifted, and now William is coming across the channel. And so they heard that and quickly moved back down south again to meet the invasion there. William, his army, and 3,000 horses landed at Pevensey Bay near the modern seaside resort of Hastings. So Harold of Norway was aided by the winds to come down this way. But then the winds died down, and so William was able to cross from Normandy over to England. Here we have a Viking soldier preparing to throw a spear. And we have two Viking soldiers posing for this other photograph. You didn't know we had photographers back then. And you can see the different style of dress when we look at the Saxons in the next picture. The battle axe that he is holding there, that might be hard to see. I think you can see it better than I can. See, this is the axe part. That's called a battle axe. It's not a woman, it's a weapon. The long handle made it a devastating Saxon weapon against the Norman cavalry. I'm sorry, I guess those are Saxons on the right. I had a long reach, but the head was not heavy enough to make it unwieldy. It was noted that in the right hands, it could kill a rider and horse in one blow. The first thing that William did when he landed was to build fortifications. But he was surprised to find there was no opposition. No one was there to greet him. He was a little perplexed about that. What he didn't know is that Harold of Wessex had been up in the north fighting against Harold of Norway and hadn't gotten there yet. So he sent out bands to pillage the countryside. However, he kept his army near the fortifications because he did not know where Harold was. When Harold received news of the landing, he hurried south, reaching London on October 6th. He hastily sent out word that he needed fresh reinforcements, and October 11th, he marched south to Hastings. The Battle of Hastings was fought on October the 14th on Senlac Hill, 7 miles north of Hastings. When we were in England, I asked our guide about going to Hastings. I've always thought I'd like to see where this battle took place. He kind of dismissed my suggestion and said, "There's nothing there." So still, seeing the countryside would be nice too. But anyway, we'll have to be satisfied with videos that are taken. At the beginning of the battle, Harold's forces, both sides had about 7,000 men. It appears that Harold might have had some more, but they had the advantage because they occupied the high ground, which you're going to see in a little video I have to show you. But because they fought on foot in the English tradition, because for them, all men on horses dismounted to fight with a battle axe or a spear. They didn't think of fighting from on top of a horse might be an advantage. They all got off their horses to fight. So they were no match for the archers and mounted knights of the Normans who stayed on their horses. According to the Bayeux Tapestry, which I'll show you a picture of in a minute, it's a tapestry which someone sewed of the battle. Harold was killed with an arrow during the battle. To accomplish the final victory, the Normans feigned a retreat, and this action drew the English down from the higher ground and were then easily surrounded and killed. And so we'll see a reenactment here in just a moment. First of all, here are Normans with what are called kite shields, and they wore 3/4 chain mail with neck protection. And you can see where Normandy is there, and Hastings on the coastline there. And you can see Pevensey as well. Here's a close-up. Here's a Saxon with a spear and shield. The Saxons used round shields. The kite shields were predominantly Norman. On his right thigh is a small axe. I don't know if you can see that. His sword hangs down on the left. The Saxon soldier has a chainmail and a sword. On his right thigh, you can see the long handle. Whoops. On his right thigh, you can see the long handle of the Danish battle axe that proved itself to be a fearful weapon. Can't find my cursor. There it is. How many of Harold's troops wore armor like this is difficult to answer. Almost certainly the most important ones were protected. Much armor and weaponry must have been acquired from the victory over the Vikings at Stamford Bridge that they brought with them. So that would explain why they may have had some Viking weapons. Okay. Now let's see this reenactment. And there's no sound. Is there sound off? Or is this a proverbial problem?
It is. Let me go. All right, think.
I think you did something down there before, didn't you?
I did. I don't think it's on there. It was, I could try and see what I need to do. That's in the right place. Yeah, check there. That's in the right place. All right. It's the where am I going here? I gotta go to sound.
Is it
Remember how to do
down
it?
here?
Oh, yeah, that's right there.
Yeah.
It's on, see, it's on the wrong thing.
Yep.
I gotta go to speakers. There we go. Take that. Make that back full again. It's over there. Come back. Come back. Oh, there it is. Is it gonna give me the?
How could it be there and not there?
I don't know. That's a good question.
There.
All right, you want to go back to the beginning?
Yeah, we might have to go back to the previous slide. Oh, there.
The Battle of Hastings was composed of 2 hills surrounded by thick woods. Harold had positioned his army on the ridge's highest point and formed his troops in a shield wall blocking the road leading to London. Even though formidable in front of assaults, his army was a remnant of a bygone era mainly composed of infantry with no supporting units or cavalry, which limited his movability and versatility. The bulk of his forces was spurred militia, farmers armed with axes, spears, and swords, but in the center of the formation, Harold positioned his elite household guards, highly trained and well-equipped professional soldiers, armed with a mighty two-handed Danish axe that could come easily through a shield. The king would fight on foot, positioned in the center of his formation, surrounded by his bodyguard. All in all, Harold's army numbered around 9,000 to 10,000 men. On the other side of the field, the Duke of Normandy slowly positioned his troops in formation. The Norman army at Hastings starkly contrasted with their Anglo-Saxon enemies. William had brought a highly trained force of professional knights capable of prolonged campaigning and even field fortifications. Combining three different military arms, it was a well-balanced and flexible force that included a contingent of archers and, most crucially, mounted knights, which would go on to dominate the Middle Ages. Essentially, it was a clash between the old Norse way of war and the modern continental fighting style. The Duke arranged his forces into three divisions. On the far left of his formation were positioned the Bretons. The Normans held the center under the direct control of William, who commanded the army from his proud steed. On the left was mainly composed of Frenchmen. The front line was made up of archers, while the line right behind them was assembled from heavily armored infantry. The formidable Norman mounted knights were kept in reserve. Most modern historians agree that the Norman army was slightly outnumbered by the Saxons and would not have exceeded 7,000 to 8,000 men. William was the first to strike. The battle began with the sound of trumpets signaling the attack. The first line of archers moved forward and unleashed a barrage of arrows against the English shield wall, which proved ineffective due to the unfavorable trajectory since they were firing more slowly. Most of the projectiles were caught by the English shields or passed over the ranks, landing harmlessly. The Duke ordered his second infantry line to frontally assault the Saxon ranks on the hill. Around 5,000 men began marching on the slope in perfect unison. The Normans marched steadily upon the hill, trying to save their breath of the ultimate clash of arms. As the line of heavily armed knights came into missile range, the Saxons unleashed a hail of projectiles against the thin line of advancing steel to little effect. Undeterred, the Norman infantry reached the English shield wall, engaging in a ferocious and bloody melee. The clash of steel and wood reverberated throughout the battlefield, now intermingled with screams of pain and anguish. The initial carnage was horrendous, with both sides were fresh and eager to attack their enemy. Every blow was effective and deadly. The Normans were trying to achieve a breakthrough or even an envelopment of one of the two wings since they could not afford a draw, while the Saxons only had to hold their lines in the which they were initially able to do. Seeing his infantry struggle under their mounted losses, William sprang into action by ordering his mounted knights to follow him in an attack across the enemy line. The Duke was laying for peace. Norman cavalry and infantry were soon attacking the Saxon shield wall. Despite the ferocity of the mounted attack, the English shield wall still held, giving no cause to be done. During the ferocious hand-to-hand combat, the Norman left wing began to buckle, eventually retreating under pressure. The debacle on the left wing triggered a domino effect, which caused the whole Norman line to retreat. Harold barred orders to his troops not to chase the retreating enemy and hold their ground, but a few right-wing contingents abandoned their positions, chasing after the retreating Roman left. This critical consequence.
Remember, what was the advantage that the English had here was the high ground. Now they're giving it up to chase after the Normans.
What's wrong?
Oh, by the way, I want firing the arrows and they went too high because of the hill. I can't tell you how many times in history in battles that has happened where the what was being shot at was overshot. Well, so we probably never do it in here. For example, right before Pickett's charge during the Battle of Gettysburg, the Confederate guns were firing at the line of Union guns up on Cemetery Ridge. And when the Union guns stopped firing, there was so much smoke and stuff from the Union guns firing that the Confederacy thought they had knocked out all those guns, but they hadn't. They had overshot. So when Pickett and his men charged, all those Union guns just could mow them down, and that's why they lost that part of the battle. It's because of miscalculation. Also happened in World War II. On the other side of the English Channel from here, when we were firing artillery into Normandy for the invasion of against the Nazis. Again, we thought we were hitting their artillery, but overshot. And so when our guys landed, they met a lot more resistance than what they anticipated, because the big guns of the Allies had not done what they thought they had. Okay, well, back to Hastings.
But the truth, which could have proven disastrous for Norman morale. William then removed his helmet and rode along the line, shouting to his troops that he was still alive, encouraging them to act on. His courage and charisma stopped the Norman retreat, saving his army from the brink of disaster. William then gathered some knights around him and galloped to the aid of his left wing, still being chased by the Saxons. The Normans turned the tables on the chasing Saxons, who were surrounded and cut down to the last man. Ironically, the flight of these troops gave the tactical idea to William. After a brief lull in hostilities, the Norman Duke ordered his mounted knights to charge against the Saxons, but then retreat, trying to lure them out of their formation. Every Norman horseman was now charging upon the steep slope, inflicting heavy casualties to the irreplaceable housecarls, who were slowly being replaced by the third militia. Being less trained and disciplined, the third were much easier to lure with faint retreats. Thus, the Norman knights were gradually able to make apart the up until then immovable English line, leaving it vulnerable to counterattacks. With the sun setting and the English line troubled, Duke William sensed that the time was right for an order of assault. Infantry, cavalry, and archers simultaneously moved against the fighting Saxon lines, aiming to deal in William urged these men to fight on, knowing full well that this was the final push of the day. The English crown was within his grasp. Harold was fighting heroically in the front ranks under his banner, surrounded by his personal guard, when tragedy struck. At the height of the battle, Harold Godwinson was mortally wounded by an arrow which struck him in the eye. Thus ended the life of the last Anglo-Saxon king. News of Harold's death soon spread throughout the demoralized and battered Saxon ranks, but broke and fled to the surrounding woods. Duke William of Normandy was triumphant. Losses for the Norman side are unknown, but the Saxons were destroyed. They wouldn't be able to pose any threat against William after the disastrous outcome of the bloody field of Hastings. In the aftermath of the battle, William marched his troops in London, which he swiftly captured, squashing any resistance before him. On Christmas Day, 1066, William was crowned as the first Norman king of England, bringing the Anglo-Saxon era to an end. He would forever be known as William the Conqueror.
All right, hope you found that interesting. This is a picture of the opening scene on the Bayeux Tapestry. Harold Godwinson, I failed to mention his last name before, of Wessex is pictured there. And as you saw in the video, apparently what we see on the tapestry, at least, is an arrow went through his eye into his brain and killed him. When the victory came, William sent word to the Witan demanding that he be recognized as king. When they hesitated, William's men began to devastate the countryside. And to stop the devastation, the Witan agreed to his demand. And as you saw on Christmas Day, he was to be crowned king. Well, the crowds that gathered for the coronation were asked the customary question of whether they would take William to be their lawful king. It's kind of like a wedding ceremony. Well, the loud chorus of yeas led the Norman knights outside the church building to believe that William was under attack. And to draw off the attacker, they set fire to nearby houses. The congregation fled in panic, but somehow amidst all the confusion, William was crowned King of England. Following the Norman conquest, the Anglo-Saxon peasants were treated brutally. Roped or chained together, they were often driven from place to place like cattle. Many prisoners were urged to move faster by a poke of their captor's spear point, or ECG. Later, children listened as their elders told of having been egged on in this fashion. Tradition kept the stories alive long after Anglo-Saxons ceased to be spoken, with the result that later generations referred to their ancestors as being egged on. So that's where that comes from. William brought to England the centralized feudalism of Normandy and established himself as feudal lord over the entire country. Oh, by the way, the advent of the Normans gives you an idea of where many of the French words in our language originate. So, you know, the English of today is a combination of Anglo-Saxon words and French words and German words and a lot of other places, but the French definitely comes from the Normans. William divided his holdings among his military followers, feudal vassals that were called tenants in chief. To maintain power, he required all subsequent vassals through sub-infeudation to also swear allegiance to him as their lord. He also extended his authority over the English church, appointing the bishops. To determine taxable resources, William commissioned a great survey. His royal officials traveling throughout the country, gathering detailed information about property holders and their possessions. The findings were collected in a record known as the Domesday Book. He brought with him Lanfranc. He was the head of the monastery at Bec. And that's important because when Lanfranc left Bec, a monk was put in charge, and his name was Anselm. When Lanfranc died and he was the Bishop of Canterbury, put in by William the Conqueror, he was replaced by Anselm again. And so we have in 1093 Anselm of Canterbury. In these final years of the 1090s, Anselm would write his famous Monologion, his Proslogion, and then that classic text, Cur Deus Homo, which we'll talk about later. It means why God-man, in which he sets out a great explanation as to why it was important that Jesus be the God-man. So the 1090s was the trending of Anselm. Another extra, the word haggard comes from this time. Have you ever felt haggard? Has anyone ever told you look haggard? Well, the Normans brought with them their own style of falconry. A wild bird trapped for falconry was called a haggard. These haggards were often uncontrollable and difficult to train. and soon haggard was being used to describe unruly, intractable people, and eventually the gaunt appearance of an exhausted person. The reforms strengthened royal authority, a new line. William's sons, William II and Henry I, if you put them together, you got a great name, died without an heir. The crown eventually passed to the Plantagenet family, founded by Henry II, the great-grandson of William the Conqueror. Being French, Henry possessed more wealth and territory outside of England than within. As you can see on this map, the domain of Henry II is England, but even more of France. So as much as there's been rivalry between England and France over the years, some of it goes back to this, is that the King of England was once also the ruler over that much of France. So he was able to gain land holdings in France that far surpassed those directly ruled by his feudal lord, the French king. So even though he was a vassal to the French king, he actually owned more land than the French king did. Until this time, each lord had his own court for hearing cases involving his own vassals and peasants. But Henry expanded the jurisdiction of the royal courts by establishing circuit courts with justices who traveled throughout the land hearing cases. Circuit means you ride on a circuit, in a circle between different towns. Before the circuit justices arrived in a shire, a jury composed of men of that district would make a list of indictments or accusations of what crimes had been committed and who the suspected offenders were. Often a small group of men would assist, and gradually it became an accepted practice to have 12 good and truthful men to serve on this jury. Unlike today's jury, these men gave evidence instead of giving the verdict, but it's where we get our idea of 12-man jury. The decisions of Henry's justices provided uniform laws for all of England and thus superseded the local feudal laws. So before that, when you went from one shire to another, the laws might be different. But after Henry made these adjustments, you could count on there being common law from district to district. And that not only helped ensure justice, but also helped to draw the English people together into a unified nation. And that's where we get this idea of common law, is what was common throughout the land. By the time of Henry II's reign, it had become customary for all that could read to claim clergy status so that they could be tried in church courts where they would hand down lighter sentences and deprive the king of revenue. Because at the time of illiteracy, it was generally accepted that only clergy could read. And so if you could read, it was assumed you must be clergy. This was possible because it was assumed that only clergy could read. But many who could not simply memorized a passage of scripture and quoted it when a friend turned to that portion to let him read to the court, proving thereby that he was a member of the clergy. Church courts handed down lighter sentences, as I said, and so that was an advantage if you could be tried in a church court as a member of the clergy. This issue brought Henry into conflict with the Archbishop of Canterbury. Henry thought to gain control over the church by appointing his friend, Thomas à Becket, as Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest church office in England. À Becket wasn't even a priest when he was appointed and had served as Henry's chancellor, but he became Henry's enemy when Henry attempted to interfere in church affairs, especially when he attempted to bring clerics to trial in royal courts instead of church courts. Henry finally ordered Becket out of England. So here's his friend, Thomas à Becket, and he says, hey, if I appoint him Archbishop of Canterbury, I won't have any more problems with the church. But it turns out his friend had a lot more integrity than he anticipated and stuck to the rules that he felt he should in force as the head of the Church of England. When Becket was in exile, Henry II had other bishops crown his oldest son as his successor. Angered by this usurpation of his authority, Becket obtained excommunication orders from the Pope for all bishops and clergy who had participated. Upon his return, Becket announced the excommunication of most of the higher clergy in England. This action infuriated Henry. Outraged at Becket's resistance, Henry reportedly exclaimed, "What a pack of fools and cowards I have nourished in my house, that not one of them will avenge me, this turbulent priest." Hearing these words, 4 knights decided that they would fulfill Henry's request, and they went to the Archbishop Becket when he was at the altar in the church and murdered him. Because of public uproar over this event, the king abandoned his plans to control the clergy, and Becket became a martyr and his tomb a popular shrine. In fact, we'll talk about this later, but the Canterbury Tales by Chaucer, you've heard of them, I think. Those were tales told on the way to the tomb of Becket. All right, we're going to stop there tonight. And next week, we'll get into what... Well, there's a Becket being murdered. To what John had mentioned earlier, and look at the Magna Carta. You've all heard of it. We'll talk about what helped to bring that about. Any questions or comments about anything that we've talked about tonight? There's a movie made about Thomas à Becket. And again, my old age mind is not coming up with the title of it. Anybody remember?
About Becket?
About Becket, about Thomas à Becket.
No.
I'll think of it by next week and tell you. I thought about watching it, but it would, it would be like 2 or 3 hours. Yeah. All right. So we'll stop there tonight. If there's any other comments or questions.
Well, with Alfred, what's it all about, Alfred?
Didn't you say that once before about another Alfred?
I don't think so. but
Sounds familiar.
It's found. But
I don't know if it's this one, but there's one called Becket. In 1964, British historical drama film. About to say Becket.
Oh, maybe,
I think this was like a Hollywood thing.
yeah,
1964.
that would have been the right year, but I thought it had a different title. Maybe not. Maybe it is the title.
78% on Rotten Tomatoes.
Oh, 78%. That's pretty good. Yeah.
Oh, popular.
Yeah. Intense and emotional. They had Rotten Tomatoes back then.
Intense and emotional.
Epic.
Yeah.